is that all of you who want to hear me talk, leave, go outside, okay, and I'll come outside and talk to you. And then whoever wants to stay in here on the side is fine.
Shut him down. This is the world of the social justice warrior. They only want to allow free speech when it is ideas or opinions that they agree with. Any form of wrongthink is to be shut down. You can mince words and rightly say that free speech only applies when the government is the one keeping voices muted. But what can be more insidious than stifling of a voice by the people in charge is censorship by mob rule. At McMaster University, Professor Jordan Peterson was set to discuss his ideas, but since they are the wrong ideas, he was not allowed to. Professor Peterson took the discussion outdoors, and there he made an attempt at educating these 5-year-olds on having a good conscience. Basically, he's saying, what if you're wrong?
Okay, so the question is, I made the point that it's a good idea to let your conscience guide you. And the question is, what happens if your conscience guides you in a bad direction? And that can happen. I would say, look, if you want to rely on your conscience, and you want to rely on the sense of meaning that guides you, you have to make sure that you don't tell lies and muddy yourself up with deceit, because you pathologize your being, and then it can't speak to you properly. So if you want to use an internal guidepost to orient yourself through life, you have to be honest, because otherwise you're going to follow something that's sick, and that's a terrible mistake. So the reason that you don't lie isn't because there's a rule against it. The reason that you don't lie is because you'll make yourself pathological if you do. And then you won't be able to trust yourself. And if you can't trust yourself, well, then you can have your political party and trust that, or you can have nothing. And neither of those things are reasonable replacements.
Jordan Peterson is being branded for hate speech. The reason it is important to listen to him speak of having a reliable conscience is because the accusations are based only because these people disagree with him. And it's circular, since Jordan Peterson's alleged hate speech is his stated disagreement with a law that he feels infringes on his rights. He is not advocating any specific sanction or violence against any protected class of people. In the most liberal interpretation of hate speech, disagreeing in and of itself can be found nowhere.
It's best to let the unreasonable opposition speak, because they manifest themselves as unreasonable, and then everyone can see it. And so that's part of the reason that you want free speech, right?
Unfortunately, they do not want free speech. They want to censor you for your wrong thing. Some in the SJW community have decided that you are not allowed to voice your opinion, that you are not allowed to voice your opposition to what you consider a bad law. Bill C-16 is an act to amend the Canadian Human Rights Act and the Criminal Code. If I understand Jordan Peterson on this matter, it's not so much the protection of classes of people, it's the compulsory requirement to address people by any arbitrary set of pronouns that could indeed change from minute to minute.
All right, so I can tell you a little bit about why I was opposed to Bill C-16. And there's a variety of reasons. I think the most important one is that it's the first piece of Canadian legislation that's ever been put forward that actually requires people to use a particular set of words. Now, there is other legislation that does govern to some degree what you can't say. So, for example, you can't incite a crime, and that's perfectly logical. It's a reasonable restriction on free speech. But we've never had a piece of legislation ever that would require you to use a certain kind of vocabulary. And regardless of what that vocabulary is, and the fact that it happens to be about transgendered terminology, hypothetically, is almost beside the point, as far as I'm concerned. You know, this all focused on this particular issue, and it had to focus on some issue. But this isn't the issue that's at the bottom of it. It's just that complex things manifest themselves in very particular locations, and this just happens to be the location that this is manifesting itself in. Now, the other thing that I really didn't like and still don't like about Bill C-16 is the surrounding policies that are basically part of what it's embedded in, that were produced by the Ontario Human Rights Commission, which I think is an appallingly dangerous organization, not least because they're terribly muddy thinkers.
Amen.
And so, one of the things that's happened that I think is reprehensible from a psychological perspective is that in Ontario and soon likely in Canada, we're going to write into law an idea of identity that's just radically insufficient. So let me give you some examples. So the way that Bill C-16 is currently formulated, if you take into account the surrounding policy documents, there's a proposition embedded in the law, and that is that biological sex, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual preference vary independently. And the fact of the matter is that's not true. And you can demonstrate it very straightforwardly. The first thing you observe is that virtually everyone whose biological sex is either male or female has a gender identity of male or female. In fact, the people who don't fit into that category, they exist, there's no doubt about that, but they're a very small minority. Yep. And the reason I'm pointing out that they're a small minority is because it makes the claim that those things vary independently false.
Right.
And then you note too that most of the people who have a binary biological sex and a binary gender identity also present themselves in a manner that's the same as their gender identity and their biological sex. And so that's another indication of the non-independence of the three layers of purported identity. And finally, you can see too that the vast majority of people, for example, men who are biologically male, who present themselves as male, or who identify as male, who present themselves as male, are also heterosexual. 95% of them, perhaps 98% of them, depends on the statistics.
These are his well-stated objections to Bill C-16. Notice that the professor is not advocating that there be less rights for individuals who do not conform to standards that the majority of people consider normal. He is going out of his way to use a language that respects anyone's right to identify any way they want. He is not saying it's nonsense for people to be gender non-binary or gender fluid or any of the endless new terms for the countless genders that are now available to us, when back in the bad old days of humanity, we had only two. He is not advocating that people have less choices. He is only advancing his own freedom of conscience.
The reason that I think that this is a problem is because it's written into the law. And the law isn't the place where you debate those sorts of things. You don't instantiate a particular philosophy into the law, especially one that's predicated on what I would say it's absolutely incoherent. And not only that, like even if you're thinking about it from the perspective of someone, say, who's homosexual, one of the arguments that people who are gay very frequently use is that there's actually a biological underpinning to their homosexuality. Right. But we're going to dispense with that? Well, what happens if we dispense with that?
Right.
What happens if we dispense with the idea that there's a biological underpinning to homosexuality?
Outrage.
Does that mean that it can just be changed? And what are people going to do with that piece of information except try to change it? Right. The people who've been fighting for homosexual rights for the last 30 years very frequently made the case that the reason that the rights were necessary was because there was a reality to the condition. Well, I'm not arguing for that or against it. What I'm saying is that the law, the way it's currently constituted, makes arguments like that completely invalid.
This is an important point that his opponents have not thought through. Without biological underpinning of the sexes, it is legitimate to advocate for gay conversion therapy, or maybe pray the gay away. Maybe that sounds ridiculous, but in the United States there is legislation popping up disguised as religious freedom laws, but are thinly veiled attempts to allow people to discriminate based on sexual identity of others. But the same logic is used to justify them. This is a flawed analogy, since it is a reaction to the landmark Supreme Court decision allowing marriage equality throughout the land. But it is cogent, since people are demanding their same freedoms to express themselves. Be careful what you wish for.
The reason that I'm telling you this is because
Social justice is now a religion or a dogma. or both. If you do not agree with what they say today, and that could change tomorrow, then you cannot speak. When they chant, shut down Peterson, they are advocating for a system that one day may turn on them and force them to be silent. They are paving the way for an authoritarian government that agrees with their mindset, and the SJWs will be among the first to be silenced.
There's no reason whatsoever to presume that the laws that are being put in place to protect the people that these laws are supposed to protect will do anything that remotely resembles protecting them. And as I mentioned when we were in the hall, when I talked to you about the letters that I've received from transsexual people, they're very terrified about all of this. Because the vast majority of them want to be as invisible as everyone else wants to be. And all this does is draw negative attention to them. They're also not very happy about the fact that they're being represented noisily by people who have absolutely no right to speak for them.
Who gets to decide? Does the loudest voice speak for you? Is this the future you want? Remember, might makes right, and this mob wants to enforce that maxim. Are the handful of people blowing horns, shouting, and disrupting the free exchange of ideas speaking for your best interest? Remember, what is at stake is everyone's best interest. While attempting to consider what is the good for all, you have not considered the personal opinion of approximately 7 billion people on the planet. Human rights include everyone, not who you decide it should be.
So, one of the things we really have to get over, and in a serious way, is the idea that just because you're talking to someone black or white or transsexual or homosexual, that you're speaking to a member of a homogenous tribe, and that the opinion that they happen to have is the opinion that all those who are like them share. There's nothing that's more racist than that assumption, right? Because it means that you know a damn thing about you except the most boring part of your identity. And I can predict everything that you are and everything that you think. Well, that's a terrible thing to believe. And it's also patently untrue. You know, there's no reason to assume that any group of people who don't fit into tradition of society for some way are any more homogenous in their general makeup and their political views than any other group. In fact, all the evidence suggests precisely the contrary. And there's another thing I really don't like about identity politics.
The regressive left is a term that has been used recently. After the appalling Ben Affleck appearance on the Bill Maher show, many people, including myself, have opened their eyes, not to the regressive nature of some progressives, but the authoritarian methods they use to enforce what they claim is the truth. Just listen to how the self-appointed judge and jury for free expression and free speech, Steve Shives, commands his groupthink.
Does that mean that every propagator of every theory and ideology is entitled to a platform and an audience? No, of course not. And since when has that ever been the case? That's why they lean so hard on their warped, self-serving caricature of free speech, which in their interpretation includes not only the right to speak, but also the right to a microphone and an audience. But that's not how it works.
That is actually how it works. If the self-appointed priests and guardians of proper thinking had their way, then nobody they disagree with would have the right to express themselves publicly, and it's a slippery slope downhill until we are commanded how to think right.
I can tell you a little bit about why these attempts to shut people down are being made, because you need to know this. So, as far as I've been able to determine, this kind of protest is an expression of a philosophy that's grounded partly in postmodernism and partly in Marxism. Now, the postmodern element is basically this. There's no such thing as genuine individual identity. What there is group identity. And you, like it or not, only have the interests of your group. And the whole world is nothing but a battleground between groups of different interests. There's no dialogue. There's no possibility of talking between the groups. It's just a power stage where combat has to take place. And so the reason that speakers with whom the radical postmodernists and the Marxists don't agree are denied a platform is because those people do not believe from a philosophical position that dialogue can bring consensus. And all that's left if you forego that particular principle is this. And this is only where it starts. You know, the fact is that you're all pretty damn civilized. And thank God for that. Because if there were enough fools in the crowd, especially those who are intent on violence, this would turn out very differently. Right. And we do not want to go down that pathway. It's a big mistake. We've been down that pathway many, many times.
It is a very similar groupthink mentality that is terribly alive in some Muslim majority regions of the world. The idea of commanding right and forbidding wrong. This is what passes for an intellectual dialogue by some at university nowadays. It is a thug mentality that does indeed command right and forbid wrong. Jordan Peterson's viewpoint of the postmodernists and Marxists may very well be spot on, but it is the method of the bully that we see here. It is a world turned on its head. There was a time nearly 50 years ago when college campuses and the university were bastions of free speech and the exchange of ideas. Many people fought hard for the right of expression. It is a world where thinking for yourself is no longer threatened by those hardened conservatives who wanted to maintain control of their religious way of life. Although they still do, the new threat is from the left, who have become hideous mirror images of their hateful right-wing counterparts. People who I seriously disagree with, no matter how entrenched they seem, are precisely those I want to sit down with to negotiate what we believe is right and wrong. It's not the herd of like-minded folks that think just like me that I need to convince. The regressive left have discovered something old as new: intolerance, censorship. They stick fingers in their ears and say blah 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 blah, I can't hear you. We have long since satirized the conservative political and religious right this way, but now they have good company. Thank you once again for watching this video. If you disagree with anything in it, do not hesitate to vent your spleen in the comments below. Please take the time to like or subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to check one of the many older videos on this channel where there is a veritable plethora of the past to be discovered, and check out one of the social media sites listed below. There is also a new Patreon page for anyone wanting to help this channel. See you next time.